but on the cover of the book, which you can see on booksellers or on the flyer about the book from the press, there's a powerful couple of photos of alternatively, you could say a growing boy or a young man, and my sense is you picked this photo partly because he's sort of a young man, or he's really a boy, but maybe treated as a man because he's holding up or has in front of him, whatever you call those letters when you were being arrested, right? Can you tell us the story about why you picked that set of photos for the cover and what it means?
Well, the photo is a picture of George Stinney, Jr., and he was a 14-year-old black boy who was executed in this country for the crime of murder with intent to rape. He is the youngest person ever executed by the electric chair to this very day. And the reason that I picked him was because there was not only evidence that he did not commit the crime, but there was an insistence that, despite the implausibility of it, that he was ultimately a rapist. And the reason I chose that photo was because it was necessary for me to censor the fact that a black boy, a child, was considered a rapist because he was a black male. And I look at that as one of the lenses that black men in this country often are read through, that it's important to understand that whereas I, for example, see potentiality and innocence in him as a boy, that most people see him as a cub, as a not yet developed beast and rapist. And not only did he get seen that way, but he lost his life in a racist American South because of it, for allegedly attacking two white women or two white girls.
14 years old?
14 years old.
14.
And imagine that, right? I mean, it carries a certain kind of weight because, Tamir Rice was 12, right? Yeah. I mean, this is the condition that most black males grow up with in this country.
And this isn't some sort of mob, though, like in Mississippi.
No.
This is the courts.
The courts found him guilty and sentenced him to death. Right? That's the weight, right? That's the weight of racism on a black male body.
14.
And to think that we exist in a world where our dominant perspective of gender, which is formed by Western feminism, doesn't allow for that kind of vulnerability to be articulated. Because the idea is, it was racism. It wasn't sexism or patriarchy that killed George Stinney. But the idea of the rapist is in direct relation to the patriarch who aims to protect the women of his race. Like, it was born in that moment. It was born in the moment of black male enfranchisement after the Civil War. So it's completely about patriarchy, right? When Rebecca Latimer is saying that she's against rape, so we should lynch 1,000 Negroes, she used the other N word, but that was about patriarchy. This is not just racism, but the kinds of violence and stereotypes and the terror and horror that black men have in the imaginations of most Americans is often dismissed and silenced within the academy. In fact, to talk about black men as being vulnerable or to be victims of violence, be it police violence and rape, or even violence by women, where women are perpetrators, is to literally be excluded from most sectors of the academy, because it's so taboo. It's something that we not only choose not to discuss, but something that we choose to disown, because black males are so overdetermined by the ideas of being violent that there's no way that we can see that violent being as being a victim of it, right? And I mean, you got to think about this. I mean, one of the ways that there's been so much buy-in from police executions of black men in this country has been on the idea that these black men were criminals and they had to do it to protect their lives.
Right.
So even the American public's like, if this black male would have did this or that, they would still be alive. Like with Trayvon Martin, if he was respectful, right, he would have been alive. This is a kid. Like, you're following a kid. You pull a gun on him, you shoot him in the heart. And the idea is that, if he was just more respectful, he wouldn't have been seen as much as a legitimate threat.
And that somehow his being disrespectful justifies him being death. Murdered, right. Being killed.
Right. So. And that's what I'm saying. Like, these are the things, these are the kinds of fantasies that we create, that somehow being disrespectful equals death. Mm-hmm. Walking down the street or pulling away from a cop equals death. A 12-year-old boy like Tamir Rice holding a gun, a BB gun, equals death. So anything that black men do that's outside of the realm of what society's confined them to can most likely lead to death, right? And that's something that I don't think we really understand in our analysis of black men, because what we do is we count the numbers of bodies. And even the numbers of bodies are in a negation, right? So even under intersectional theory, often the idea is that we focus on the death of black men far too much. And black men are killed on average in the last few years, 290 to over 300. Black men are victims of police homicide. Their female counterparts generally are between 9 and 20 on a given year. And the idea is that somehow theoretically, we need to not focus on black males' deaths because focusing on black men is patriarchal. So how do black men both become the greatest victims of patriarchal violence in terms of police homicide and state violence, but then to talk about them as the greatest victims, which is an empirical question, simultaneously becomes patriarchal violence or patriarchal silence, right? This is why the academy the theories in the academy have to be pushed beyond their present limits and boundaries, because there is a erasure that depends on the dehumanized status of black and brown men and boys that allows for them not to be centered as primary victims. I mean, could we imagine a world in which we said we've talked too much about women being victims of domestic abuse? That would cause moral outrage because there's a humanity to that, right? There's a humanity to that we talk about them, and male victims aren't far behind female victims in terms of just empirically, like if you're looking at both groups, but we still don't center it. When we talk about men, it's seen as deflecting from the larger issue, because the humanity attributed to what female victims of domestic violence is so pronounced in these instances. But when you talk about black men, either as being the primary victims of police violence and homicide or incarceration, because they're dehumanized, because we see them as less than human and undesirable, it's much easier to claim why we don't need to focus on them. Their humanity is not centered first and foremost.
Mm-hmm. Well, Tommy, this is important and heavy stuff. We're kind of running out of time, so we want to ask you a few last questions. One of our final questions we ask all of our guests is based on the inspiration of the show. Do you, whether or not philosophy bakes bread or does not bake bread, as the famous saying goes, and as a philosopher and as doing philosophy, and we're going to talk about this at the beginning of the show, that you have a sort of different version of philosophy than a lot of other philosophers have. Do you find it helpful? Do you find it bakes bread? And do you find philosophy maybe helps you? You're dealing with some very heavy stuff, and do you find it helps you maybe keep sane? I guess is the right way to ask the question.
Right. So let me say, I don't think that most philosophy does bake bread. Because it's completely impractical.
Okay.
Right? And I'll be very specific with the traditions. So I don't think analytic continental or American philosophy actually contribute in its current form to the practical problems of our society. But I think that the ideas that we learn in philosophy really that it could make us more sensitive and aware to problems if we get rid of reading or making philosophy synonymous to just our dominant ideologies, be it pragmatism or feminism or Marxism, whatever the case may be. The task of the philosopher is conceptual specificity, the idea of using concepts to articulate causal relationships of specific problems. That's why we enjoy Marx, right? That's why we enjoy pragmatism, because they made certain linkages between problems of education and social instability and how they sought to make a more robust democratic nation. The problem is because we're less well-read than the people at the turn of the century, and we don't value problems in the same way. They become ideological figures and idols for us rather than guidance or examples of how to proceed through a certain method of engaging text, concepts, and problems. In terms of sanity, it's not philosophy that keeps me sane. It's not, because most philosophy conferences simply don't welcome this kind of work because it's too challenging to our already comfortable ideas. But the sanity comes from, and I've had to talk to several colleagues, because when you we have our IRB study. I have an IRB study with a colleague out in California, and one of the things that happens is when you hear these stories, because Black men would come to my office, or they call me up, or they meet me at conferences, and they tell me the stories of how they were abused or raped as young boys. You carry that with you, right? Like you carry the fact that in some instances 20, 30-year-old men have only been able to tell their story of rape because I've read a paper that said that I acknowledge that Black men can be victims of it, right? And that's a very powerful thing to take on and share in somebody's suffering, because you see them as a human, right? You see them as a human being where someone hurt them and disappointed them. So I think the sanity comes from me. It took me a long time, because when I first started doing this work, I was really depressed, kind of. I was really impacted, and it really affected me, because, some days, like, I'm not a big crier, but like, reading these stories and hearing them, like, I would just tear up. Yeah. Because it's not just the violence that happened to them, but it's the violence that we constantly do by denying that it happens to them. Yeah. Because I've gone to conferences and told people, here's what's happened to these young Black boys. And people are like, it's not a big problem, or Black men can't be raped, or men can't be raped. They really want sex all the time. And I'm like, I'm trying to explain to people, it's like, how is this any different than what they used to say about female victims of rape? Yep. That she wanted it, that she dressed this way, that she asked for it, that, she should have been naked. I was like, why does this become so easily accessible as a desire that all men want? Right. And why do racialized men and boys, children, get lumped into that category? How does a 6-year-old boy want to have sex? Because that's the hypersexualization of that group. So I've learned, what I've done is we have a group on Facebook where different Black male scholars talk about their research. I actually wrote a book, and it's the first book ever that's dedicated to Black men as the center of study, that's utilizing their own theories. And that really helped me, because it gave me a way to start understanding and explaining some of these issues that I was being told at conferences constantly, but couldn't really get a hold on personally. Because when someone tells you that this terrible thing happened to them, that a mother's friend, for instance, used to pay them, that they were 9 years old and their mother's friend would pay them to perform oral sex on her, right? When someone tells you that, and they tell you how it's affected their relationships, that they've never been able to see themselves marrying a woman, and that they've always felt that they were unattractive and underperformed sexually because of this incident when they were a child, that they linked money to this kind of form of approval from females. What can you say as as a philosopher? Well, philosophy doesn't help you there. What helps you is understanding the humanity of the person speaking, and trying to say that there's something that you can do or develop that will get other people to sympathize with that pain. And I think the task of doing that as a philosopher when you're studying Black men and boys is that you have to fight not for the argument, but for them to be heard. Like, it's not about winning the argument that this happens. It's about getting people to hear the humanity of a voice crying out as a victim of a kind of violence that's denied to them. Right. And I think that orientation, that realizing that, fundamentally changed how I was approaching the study of Black men and boys. And that's what actually gave me some sanity, because it showed me that the way, because before I was just doing all the studies, I was like, here's the evidence. But it was impacting me, because it was like, no matter how much evidence I presented, and I presented at women and gender studies conferences, I presented everywhere. I was trying to find an audience of people to hear this work, to understand that intersectionality and feminism hasn't done its due diligence in talking about female perpetrated violence against males. And those people didn't want to engage me. Perhaps I was naive when I was first coming out. But in trying to center and show that Black men could be heard as human beings, right, I think really gave me a purpose to kind of taking on all the suffering and and trauma of these individuals.
My question, you were speaking earlier about white feminism being central to white supremacy. And as you were speaking about the 20th century, the first thing that came into my head, because I live in the South, I live here in North Carolina, and plus I read a lot. History has always been one of my favorite subjects. But when you were speaking on that, the first thing that came to my mind was a group called the Daughters of the Confederacy. These, I'm very familiar with it. Yes. Yeah, these groups started around the turn of the century in the 1920s and are largely responsible for a lot of the white supremacist statutes we see. So I just wanted to get your thoughts on that, if you had looked at that as part of your analysis of them.
Well, see, this is what's interesting. I mean, you know, the idea of womanhood in the 19th century and early 20th century was pretty much synonymous to mother and community. You have women, you know, giving grand speeches. I mean, even black women in the Atlanta Sociological Laboratory talking about how women make the laws of society. So it was not a situation where women didn't feel themselves actually contributing to and growing society and in many ways dictating social organization. The Daughters of the Confederacy were largely responsible they were auxiliaries, sometimes often working through churches to get monies to create monuments of the fallen soldiers, right? So they were responsible, I call them, you know, for the Lost Cause memorials. And the Lost Cause memorials that you find throughout the South, there's one actually in my city in Lake Charles, is honoring the soldiers of the fallen cause, which was the Civil War, that tried to preserve the agrarian economy and legacy of slavery in the United States. So the view was that it was a lost cause, but it was a righteous cause that should be respected and remembered, which is why you have these statues and monuments all through the South, you know, on various college campuses, etc. What's amazing about that is that it really does show the ways that white women have sought to inculcate and perpetuate the ideas and memories of white supremacy. I think one of the biggest flaws that we have in this country, and especially as theorists, is that we somehow take a post-civil rights view of how we view discrimination. So during the civil rights movement, because white women were defined as minorities, what we've done is we've automatically said that they are minorities. We've taken a view of Title VII in the Civil Rights Act to suggest that these are the minorities that the world has given us, where acts of genocide, imperialism, and empire somehow just don't matter anymore. They're not something that we focus on. It's not what we teach or draw our attention to when we talk about racism. So I think the Daughters of the Confederacy, very much like WKKK chapters that sprung up all around the country during the, you know, first, second decades of the 1900s, very much are in line with the kind of pro-white supremacist agenda that we in many ways see being supported today under the reign of Trump. These are white women who voted for Trump. These are white women who support his policies. These are white women who believe in the vision of a white republic. So we cannot be mistaken in the idea that white women have historically and continue to be solidly committed to the project of white superiority in this country.
It's interesting you say that, because I was just having a conversation yesterday with someone who didn't realize that the Klan thinks of itself as thoroughly Christian.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, there's a reason they're burning crosses. It's not because they hate crosses. It's because they think they're Christian.
They're Christian, yeah.
Yeah, but nobody will jump to say, well, therefore Christianity has this kind of religion. See, it's the Klansmen are weird, you know, and so it's interesting, you know, how by contrast you have certain people who call themselves Muslim doing some awful things, but then every Muslim has
exactly.
Yeah. Well,
but, you know, I always think this is funny because, you know, a lot of the research I do is on the Klan, especially in the early 20th century. And I tell people all the time, you know, the Klan celebrated feminism. The Klan celebrated women's suffrage. And they thought that it was literally the unification of the white race against the black race, because now it had more votes to subjugate black people during Jim Crow.
Wow, and I never heard that.
I think it's, I mean, because they actually write this in their constitutions. So, really? You know, there were all these local chapters, so you can look at what they were saying about women getting the right to vote in 1919, 1920, and they were overwhelmingly in support of it. And white women were like welcomed by the Klan all across the country during Jim Crow.
Interesting.
And it's so funny to me that given this is going off of your example of how we don't associate Christianity, but it's just funny how certain ideas and concepts get so dehistoricized, right? Like the whole beginning of the Klan is based on Christian doctrine, is based on this kind of divine republic idea, which is why it was supported overwhelmingly by people who even weren't part of it as maintaining the white community, doing God's work.
Right.
And when those people or those groups incorporated ideas that we think today as being completely liberal and completely anti-racist, we just separate the two, not because they're historically separated, like women's suffrage and the KKK or white supremacy, but just because we've just made that decision in our time period to say that these things are not fundamentally related. Most things in America, we just decouple them. I mean, most things in America had to deal with racism. American democracy was about imperialism. Women's rights, suffrage was about imperialism. All these things were the links. The idea was not that women deserve equality. It was that women could join white men to rule. And one of the pushbacks against black people getting the right to vote, or specifically black men getting the right to vote, was that white women felt that they were the superior group and felt that white men should enforce that. Yeah. So that's why you had that's why you had this huge push of the myth of the black rapist, the tests, the lack of civilization of black people in America. Right. So you put that in context of what happens when Obama wins office, then it doesn't become very surprising that you have this huge pushback on the idea of being governed by by a black man who also became anti-American, who became terrorist, who became barbaric, etc. It's the same.
So he was Muslim and therefore terrorist, and he's also black. So you got to sort of tie together.
His middle name is Hussein.
3 or 4 ideas,
right, exactly, and and notice how the ideal was like he couldn't be born here because the idea in the 19th century was that black people were aliens because republics reflected the idea of the people who they were from. This is Kant's geography all the way back to the 18th century. Well, so these things are very old ideas.